Hello, I'm Eric Hawkins of Team Segoy. I'll be recording some YouTube videos. I've been working on getting these done for a while now, and I think I have a couple of ideas, and I'll hopefully putting out a couple of these every week. But I thought I would start with the new set, Theros Beyond Death, and just kind of go over some cards that I was either very impressed with or very, I'll just go with unimpressed with, and maybe they're still good cards, but like they definitely didn't really live up to the hype, or maybe they just don't have the right shell quite yet. But the other ones, the ones that I've been the most impressed with, both have a good shell already, and maybe aren't necessarily the best cards in the set, but the ones that like I was a little skeptical of before and very, very impressed with now. Um, but before I go any further, let me just tell you that I also stream on twitch.tv/ConanHawk. So if you like the video, definitely hit subscribe here, but also give me a follow or subscribe over on twitch.tv/ConanHawk. Anyway, let's get right into the list and go. I'm going to start off with my least impressive cards. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. All right, so the first one up is Terranika, a Crowan veteran. Terranika, a Crowan veteran, looked like a really cool card. Like the stats were okay. It was like white for and a colorless for a 3/3, but didn't really have evasion. Didn't really have like enough power and toughness to kind of work for it. But it did make something into a 4/4. I tried out the card a little bit, and it was like really cool. It made like a Healer's Hawk into a 4/4, which is like very impressive. But usually it just kind of got blocked and it kind of died. So, I mean, it just like didn't really get to do its thing more than just like once. You ended up having to have like ways to kind of like push through your Terranika using like Fairy Guide Mother and all that stuff. And it's like, if I'm going to be trying to get this to get through, I'd rather just be playing a more impactful 3-drop, something that doesn't need a lot of its own help. And overall, it just kind of didn't really fit the bill. So this ended up being my like fifth least impressive card. Doesn't necessarily, once again, mean that it's the fifth least good card on this list, but it's the one that like didn't impress me the most. Next up, we had Clothes, God of Destiny. When this card came out, everybody was like super over the top for this card. Obviously its stats for its mana cost was very good. Making mana at your pre-combat main phase was also very good. And then also like exiling creatures when there's like the escape clause also sounded very good. What ended up happening is like basically the Gruul deck, the Gruul decks wanted to be more aggressive. They wanted to attack each time they can with their creatures, right? So you look at like maybe this plus Gruul Spellbreaker, right? And Gruul Spellbreaker costing the same amount of mana, obviously doesn't have the same amount of stats, doesn't have the same amount of like things that are going on. However, you can just attack with your Gruul Spellbreaker, and it doesn't require any extra work. And unfortunately, I think Clothes is just like not necessarily what the Gruul decks are looking for. Perhaps like in the future there'll be a deck like a Jund style deck that does want like the graveyard hate and then maybe like that extra boost in mana and doesn't really mind that it's not attacking say on turn 4, which is like kind of what I've been seeing from like the Clothes lists is like you don't necessarily like get to attack with the turn 4 because even if you like add 1 pip on 1, 2 pips on 2, you get the fifth pips from the Clothes. You're not attacking with it unless you add 2 more pips the next turn. And that's only if like nothing else has happened, if like none of your other creatures have died. Which is like kind of like a pipe dream when it comes to like when you're playing your Gruul deck because people have to kill your creatures. And if they don't, they're going to die anyway, and it doesn't really matter that the Clothes was there. It could have been almost anything. Next up, we have Storm's Wrath. Obviously, this card looks stellar. It is a red 2 for deal 4 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. The reality is that the planeswalker you want to kill the most is most likely Nissa. Nissa, well, this does kill the Nissa lands, the lands that they activate to make into creatures. It doesn't kill the Nissa because the Nissa is it goes up to 6 loyalty right away. So while yeah, it does bring the Nissa down a little bit, down to 2, and maybe it makes it more manageable. Not being like a full sweeper has made this card a little weaker. Also, there was like Shatter the Sky that came out, which is just white, white to destroy all creatures. Yeah, there's a clause of like drawing a card or whatever. But for the most part, that's basically what you're trying to get out of the Storm's Wrath. And if that can already happen with like a white card, you might just like want to be like playing that way for control deck anyway. And then also, where I thought this card would slot into would be the Fires decks, but the Fires decks are still interested in Deafening Clarion, because Deafening Clarion, while it isn't necessarily like as powerful like as a board sweep as this card, where Deafening Clarion does 3 damage and this does 4 damage, it is cheaper. And also you can give lifelink to your creatures, and with Fires being interested in giving their ginormous creatures lifelink, the Storm's Wrath is just a little weaker in that aspect. So overall I was pretty disappointed with this. And like I said, maybe there's a shelf for it later. Maybe there's like a mono red version of a deck that's interested in this. Maybe there's like a red green version of a deck that's interested in this. But as of right now, I don't see a shelf for it. And overall, it's been pretty disappointing. And I've been basically putting Clarion in the spot of every time that I wanted a Storm's Wrath. This one, next up is Polukranos. Polukranos is obviously very powerful. It is a green and a black and 2 colorless that at first it's a 6/6. It comes in with 6+1/+1 counters. And then when it comes back, when it escapes, it comes back as a 12/12. And it does fight a bunch of creatures. It has like a kind of a weird clause when it takes damage. It removes counters from itself. But overall, I think this card, when people saw it, they were like, holy cow, a 4 mana 6/6 with not a huge downside, and it has escape, and it has an ability. This card's insane. What ended up happening is like, there's a lot of great 4-drops. There's like Questing Beast, there's Shifting Ceratops, you're kind of skipping 4 a lot of the times in your like Uro, Risen Reef into the Thorn Elemental, or not Thorn Elemental, sorry, Cavalier of Thorns, the elemental that is named Cavalier of Thorns, your Nissa decks. So I think this card, if it had been printed, say 5 years ago or something, would have been a card that was just absolutely bonkers, because how the game's played out, where you wanted to have a card that ends up just like ending the game eventually. And I think that's like where this style of card is. However, because the creatures and the cards are so powerful now, this card is like not as good as it once would have been. Just being able to like fight a creature and kill it, and then come back and then fight another creature and kill it, like that isn't necessarily good enough, because the creatures that you end up having to kill, like think about like trying to fight like a Nissa with this card. Like you kill one of their 3/3 Leons, and then you bring it back, and then you kill a couple more things, but like they just keep on pumping out more creatures. There's like a lot of like must kill threats. This thing also doesn't have evasion, like it doesn't have trample, so you have to like work to give it trample. So overall, I was kind of unimpressed with this card. It like does have some nice synergies though. Like if you do put it together with like a Vivian, you can give it like more +1/+1 counters. You can then also give it trample. But like once again, it's just like I want my 4 mana 6/6s and like like that have escape and stuff like that. Not necessarily to have a bunch of other work to make it good. And in that case, I'll probably just like end up playing something like Questing Beast. Once again, like I said, this card is still very good. However, I just like think it's outclassed by other 4-drops, and that's kind of where it like ended up being, is like if you already have better options in the same colors, then I mean like there's not really a reason to like slot this card into like your decks, and that's why I've been really unimpressed with Polukranos. And then finally, for the least impressive cards, I have Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis. This card is obviously a very good card on like being able to be escaped. It is a planeswalker. It makes some tokens. However, what ended up happening is the tokens were kind of unimpressive. The decks that really wanted like an effect like this were like the aggressive decks, but the aggressive decks are like focused on getting permanents into play with a lot of pips. So while I think Elspeth is a card that could be good, like its plus could be good, or not plus. I mean, sorry, it's plus to like +2/+1 ability, because she has no plus abilities. But her plussing the creatures could be good. Making tokens when you don't necessarily have a board is good. But the hard part is like in these escape decks, unless you're getting Wrath, it's not really coming back. And if you are getting Wrath, then her +2/+1 is not very good. Overall, I did play her like in some control decks, And we're going to get into why I don't think she's super impressive in control decks later with our most impressive cards. So like a little bit of a spoiler there. But I think overall, I like there's a better option in the control decks where I think she's most effective, and I think she's the least effective in the aggro decks. But maybe there's like a chance you could like sideboard her in the aggressive decks when you do get a bunch of stuff board wiped. But even then, you probably are more interested in a card like Gideon Blackblade rather than your Elspeth Suns champion. So like when the set was first spoiled, I was super hyped for this card. I thought it was going to be like absolutely bonkers, like an only minus ability planeswalker that makes a bunch of tokens and can do some stuff, but then also has escape, so it can keep coming back and doing a bunch of that stuff. And overall, it just like never really came back, and even when it did, it was kind of unimpressive. So unfortunately, I think Elspeth Sun's Nemesis just kind of missed. And I mean, we can argue whether or not that's a good or bad thing. Obviously, they've been making incredibly powerful planeswalkers, and then this one being a little bit of a miss is probably fine. But unfortunately, I think overall, I was just a little unimpressed. And if you were looking for like a nice, good white planeswalker, I guess we have to wait a little bit longer for that. But anyway, let's go ahead and move into our most impressive cards. I'm sure that these are the ones that people wanted to see. And then also, along with the most impressive cards, after I'm done with the list of most impressive cards, I'm going to switch over to an arena view, and we'll look at some of the decks that these most impressive cards slot into. So I'm not going to talk too much about why I think they're the most impressive until we get to the decks. So it's most likely going to be me just like listing off why and then moving over to the deck lists. So first up, Setesian's Champion. I think this card is really cool. Drawing cards when you play enchantments for the Constellation and getting really large is something that's like very impressive. While it doesn't, this card is one of the cards that doesn't necessarily have the best deck slot right now. The other ones slot into decks very easily. This one is more of a build around, and it doesn't necessarily have a home right now. But I played it in a couple of different Constellation style brews, and every time it was in play, even when you like, it's very much like Edgewell Innkeeper. Every time it's in play, it turns your kind of mediocre cards into just very, very powerful cards. So like I played it in like a green white Constellation style deck, and like every one of your like pump spells, so like your all that glitters and stuff like that, or like your removal spells, like Banishing Light. Whenever you cast them, just like adding the cantrip on there and adding the +1/+1 counter was just super impactful. And then also, like I played like a Hateful Eidolon brew, when you have like Hateful Eidolon plus like Mire's Grasp, and you can like put it on there. You would like draw a card off the Hateful Eidolon, you draw a card off of the Setesian's Champion, and you kind of go nuts. I think that this card is like one of those, like I said, like an Edgewell Innkeeper thing, is that when you have it, your deck is going like crazy, and when you don't, maybe your deck isn't like as powerful as it needs to be. That's my worry with this card. But if it is, like I said, if it is going to be something like a Edgewell Innkeeper, we all know how powerful those strategies are, and when they get going, they go absolutely bonkers. So this is a tentative like most impressive card because of that, because it might not have a home. However, if it does find a home, this card is absolutely great. Next up, we have Thassa Deep Dwelling. I think when the gods were spoiled, this one was like a little weird. Obviously, like blinking cards is like very, very cool. You can blink, come into play ability, stuff like that. Its tap ability was like kind of bad, and then also like it doesn't really turn on very easily. But as I've been watching a lot of the things here, you get to like one of the things about her blink ability is that when you target a creature that you control but you don't own, it actually comes back on your side when it leaves play. So if you for instance, Agent of Treachery, or not Agent of Treachery, we'll say you threaten, you act of treason your opponent's creature. Normally you have to give that creature back at end of turn. If you blink the creature that you Agent of Treachery, actually Thassa will keep it on your side forever. Until the game's over. Not actual forever. You don't like just like own the card then. But yeah, so Thassa just like having that interaction made this card go like pretty over the top, and we'll kind of get into that when we see the deck list in a little bit here. But I think that was like the most impressive thing to me. Is like I was like, the tap ability is kind of bad. You don't really get to attack with her. You have to like build a bunch of these like come into play abilities, and yeah, you do want come into play abilities, but I didn't really realize how impactful like the threaten plus Thassa ability is, and we'll see a deck list in a little bit that takes advantage of that, and it's really, really cool. All right, next up we have Nightmare Shepherd. Nightmare Shepherd was a card that I was like, four mana, 4/4 flyer isn't bad. And then also it has like this text, and like, but like how cool or how good could that be? And what I found out, it's really great. So similar in to Thassa, with Nightmare Shepherd, if you do end up like claim the Firstborning a card and sacrificing it, you do get a 1/1 version of the card that you sacrificed of your opponents if you do want to exile it from their graveyard, which is really cool. You can get around like cards with like escape, like something like Woe Strider. You could claim the Firstborn, sacrifice the Woe Strider to one of your sacrifice abilities, and then end up getting the 1/1 Woe Strider and the Goat. So that's like really cool. But the other thing is like if you have any like threats that don't necessarily need their power and toughness to matter too much, then you can like sacrifice them, and then when they do get targeted with like a removal spell, or you could just let them die to the removal spell, and then the Nightmare Shepherd will end up bringing them back as a 1/1. For instance, if you have something like Mayhem Devil, this card works really well with Mayhem Devil because say they have, something that does 3 damage, but maybe not 4 damage, or like, -3/-3 or something like that. Your Mayhem Devil can come back, which means that they're going to have to use 2 removal spells in order to get rid of your Mayhem Devil. Also, it does also pseudo protect those cards. They like say they have a Murderous Rider. Now they can't really Murderous Rider your Mayhem Devil, so they have to Murderous Rider your Nightmare Shepherd, and you get to keep that. So I think overall, it being kind of like a pseudo protection card, but also just like having super high synergies with the sacrifice decks and the sacrifice, like claim the Firstborns and stuff like that. I think this card is kind of just like a home run for those style of decks. And those style of decks were already really popular with like the red-black sacrifice decks and the Jund sacrifice decks, like the Jund food decks. So I think this card having some of those synergies in mind with the card, I think this card is just absolutely great. Next up, we have I'm gonna do these two kind of together, but next up we have Ashiok. Ashiok, when at first glance, I was like, okay, your normal 5 mana planeswalker. It pluses to get a little bit of card advantage. It -3s to like kind of removal spell, and then it like minuses to do something kind of crazy. And yeah, the templating is pretty great there. It's pretty, I should say, not great. It's pretty boring there. But it does it in a different way, which is really cool. The +1 making it 2/3 instead of like drawing a card is very cool. The -3 to like bounce a permanent, make them exile a card from their hand, could actually be like actual hard removal, unlike the other ones where like you can like kind of tuck it away with like Teferi Hero of Dominaria, or like destroy a creature. This one can like actually kill like almost any permanent, obviously non-land. But like I think this card, at first glance when I first saw it, I was like, it's an okay planeswalker. If I'm playing those colors, I might be interested in that card. It's like fine-ish. And then as I've been playing it and as I've been seeing it be played, this card has been absolutely nuts every time I've seen it in play. The tokens, just like protecting it, also kind of gumming up the board, and also adding to Ashiok's -7 ability. And then the -3 makes it so that your opponent has to like hold either like non-relevant cards or lands in their hands, so that if the -3 does happen, they don't just like end up discarding their best permanent on board. So like it changes the way that your opponents have to play the game. And then also just like, the bounce ability, even if they do keep cards in hand, is still pretty great as like a tempo play. So overall, this Ashiok has very, very impressive, and I would not be surprised to see just a ton of this card everywhere. And then finally, I think a lot of people kind of skipped on this card. This card is called Dream Trawler. It's a 6 mana 3/5 that has flying and lifelink, and then whenever you draw a card, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and then when it attacks, you draw a card, and then also you can discard a card to give it hexproof, but then you'd have to tap it. Overall, this card is just, it gives you card advantage, and then also it gives you a huge life total boost if it just like attacks once or even blocks once. And then you can combo this with things that just draw you cards. Like, who doesn't want that, right? Like, you get, this plus maybe like a Teferi minus to bounce something, it gets bigger, all that type of stuff. And then the other thing is like, if you do have a bunch of cards, this card is very, very hard to remove. Maybe they can like, tap it for a couple of turns or something and maybe sneak in a win that way. But like I said, if this card gets to block once or gets to attack, you're most likely not losing that game, especially if you get to attack, because you get to draw an extra card every turn. So overall, I think a lot of people just kind of saw it and was like, 3/5 for 6 mana, flying, lifelink, I guess. It's like, yeah, it kind of has hexproof, but then it can't attack. And then as I seen it be played, it's like, I'll be watching like, these Esper control decks or these blue-white control decks, and they're kind of falling way, way behind. And then what those decks have been missing a lot, the control decks, is a finisher. And I think both Ashiok and Dream Trawler are great finishers for those decks. And especially the Dream Trawler. I think the Dream Trawler just can can turn the corner and then essentially put it so that your opponent can't just draw one of their reach spells. So like one of their burn spells, or maybe like a Grey Merchant of Asphodel, and just like end the game that way. It just like makes it so that the game is like super locked up. You've turned the corner, you're up on resources, and now you're also up on life total, which is very, very good. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to switch over to my arena view here and give you all just a couple of decks that I think these can go into. And we're going to start off back with the Cetaceans Champion. So let me switch views here. And here, like I said, this was it was the, was it Legend VD was the person that put this on the arena preview event. And I think this is just like one of the builds that you could see with this. You get something like Calyx to both like to fill your hand up with enchantments. You get to use you have enchantments that are removal. You have enchantments, or like you can get more card or creatures off your enchantments. Obviously more things with like Elspeth Conquers Death and stuff. So I think overall this deck could be one of the building blocks of it, not necessarily the building of the Cetaceans Champion, but you can obviously see just like if you get this into play, adding draw card to any of these, or sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 creature or 6 permanents, and then also Calyx being able to fill your hand up, and then the Cetaceans Champion filling your hand up, and then just kind of going nuts from there. Obviously wanting to have more lands, so like something like Dryad of Isulin's Grove is really good there to like make sure that you're always hitting land drops, and maybe even multiples per turn. Maybe you could play like more colors than this, but this is just like one of the first iterations of this deck. But I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more decks like this, so that they can like take advantage of things like Cetaceans Champion. And maybe even the Dryad, which is like one of the cards that I had thought about putting in here, but it's not necessarily a standard card. It's more of a other format card. So discard changes. I must have clicked something by accident. And then next up on our list, or on our original list, sorry, we had Thassa. So Thassa is in the Croaky's list of Teamer Elementals. Couple of sweet synergies here. Obviously taking advantage of Claim the Firstborn and the Crowan War, and then using those to either neoform away the creatures that you steal or blink them with Thassa. So blinking with Thassa, like I said before, it says at the beginning of your end step, exile up to one other target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. So it doesn't care about ownership, it only cares about who is controlling it at the time, and you would be controlling at the time. Similarly, you can claim the Firstborn and then sacrifice the creature to neoform. You don't get the creature, but say you stole a 3-drop, then you would be able to go and end up finding a Thassa for your troubles, and then kind of like your next Claim the Firstborn just ends up being yours. Or you can find something like Omnath if you already have the Thassa to like blink out your Omnath. So a lot of really cool synergies with the Thassa in this deck. You have like Risen Reef, Omnath, Cavalier of Thorns, all working to trigger your come into play abilities, but then also the Crowan War and Claim the Firstborn to work with your Thassa and Neoform. So like once again I said it's just like a bunch of really cool synergies just working all together to make a pretty powerful deck out of a god that I didn't think was going to be super great at the beginning, and am realizing that in a deck like this, or like a shell like this, it is actually very impressive, and it maybe give the elemental deck like the push that it needed, because before the elementals deck was okay, but it needed a little bit more, and maybe this is the little bit more that it needed as well. All right, next up we had the Nightmare Shepherd. I talked about the black-red sacrifice deck, and I also talked about like the Jund sacrifice deck, but this deck is actually one of the decks that is available because of Theros Beyond Death, and that is Mono Black Devotion. And you can see a lot of its synergies in this deck. So one of the things that you can do with the deck is you could like sacrifice something like Yarick's Fenlurker to make them discard a card. So, you know, like Fenlurker comes into play, your opponent exiles a card from their hand. If you have a way to sacrifice Yarick's Fenlurker and a Nightmare Shepherd in play, and your opponent has no cards in hand, when they go to draw for the turn, you can stop them after the draw before their main phase, and you could sacrifice Yarick's Fenlurker and then use Nightmare Shepherd's ability to bring it back as a 1/1. Obviously, Yarick's Fenlurker is a 1/1, but you could bring it back as a 1/1 Nightmare, and then they would have to exile that card that they drew for the turn before they could even play it. If it is an instant, they could play it at instant speed. But if it's if it's a land, or if it's a creature, or it's a planeswalker, or a sorcery or anything like that, it will exile before they get the chance to play it. And then the other great synergy here is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Grey Merchant of Asphodel in this deck usually comes down for like 5 or 6 damage. So, or more. I mean, you can definitely have more, but a lot of the times if your opponent's interacting with you, it's going to be 5 or 6 damage. But then if you do end up having a Nightmare Shepherd and a way to sacrifice the Grey Merchant of Asphodel, then you can play the Grey Merchant of Asphodel, you can drain them for that 5 or 6 damage, then you could sacrifice it to whatever you have to sacrifice, we'll say Witch's Oven here, and then bring back the Grey Merchant of Asphodel as a 1/1. It does keep its converted mana cost because it is a copy of the Grey Merchant of Asphodel, so then you would drain for that 5 or 6 damage again, which is obviously very, very punishing for your opponent, because they just, like, you know, maybe lost 10 to 12 life, and then you gained 10 to 12 life, most likely ending the game if that's the case. But, like, if not, like that, you know, most games can't take a 20-point to 24-point life swing. So really, really cool synergies there. And like I said, using it with the sacrifice matters. So here you have a Yara and Witch's Oven, and also Woe Strider. In other decks, you could have like Woe Strider plus Oven. You could have something like Priest of the Forgotten Gods. Just like a bunch of good ways to sacrifice things. And Nightmare Shepherd just like making those styles a little bit more powerful is very big. And the reason I wanted to group the last two together is because they're in the same deck. We have Dream Trawler and we have Ashiok Nightmare Muse in this deck. So this is your traditional like Esper hero deck, which focuses on basically, you know, the Hero Precinct 1 and a bunch of gold cards to make a bunch of tokens. But it's also kind of like your tap out mid-range deck that just plays like overall great cards. And just adding Ashiok and Dream Trawler both gives it a better top end than it had previously, but also adds to those just like actual great cards on rate. So once again, not a ton to talk about here because these cards are just kind of great on rate. But I think this shell here just kind of showcases how powerful these cards are, because Esper Hero had kind of fallen off, even though it was like a powerhouse when Teferi Hero of Dominaria was in Standard, or I should say just Dominaria itself was in Standard. But then it just kind of missed something like a Teferi, and Ashiok gives it that push. Like the standalone planeswalker that is very powerful on its own, and if it doesn't get dealt with, it will kill you. And then Dream Trawler just gives it another avenue of attack rather than just like a bunch of little small creature tokens. And then also just like refueling you with like a bunch of great cards. So overall, I think the Ashiok and the Dream Trawler going into the Esper Hero deck might move it up like to one of the top tiers of Standard, and very, very interested to see where it goes from there. But like I said, these cards are the two most impressive cards to me, and the fact that they can go in the same deck is you know, pretty impressive and something to watch out for sure. Going back to our list here, so if you have any questions, comments, maybe, you know, you're not as impressed with one of these cards, or maybe one of these least impressive cards has been really impressing you, let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll be doing a bunch more of these. If you have not seen on Twitter, I've been putting up my tier rankings on Twitter. Thinking about doing a little bit of a video of those as well. so that you can kind of see my thought process and all that stuff. And then you can also just, yell at me if I get, if your favorite deck that has been performing outstandingly is doing great. You can, be like, well, I think mono black should be, S tier or whatever. You can definitely let me know that. Once again, you can find me here on YouTube, or you can find me on twitch.tv/ConanHawk. If you liked the video, hit the subscribe button. And if you really liked me, you can also subscribe to me on twitch.tv/ConanHawk. Once again, I'm Eric Hawkins of Team Segoy. Thank you for watching.